The Lord gives and the Lord takes away. If you have ever been to a Christian funeral, you may have heard this phrase. In the midst of tragedy and the loss of lives, Christians, including pastors, often turn to this verse as a message of comfort for the grieving family. I have been on the receiving end of these words before. When my friend Cecilia died, we were completely broken over how her death happened. Cecilia was very young, vibrant, and a beautiful soul who held her family together. Everyone who knew her also knew the important role she played in the church. So, when she fell sick, pastors across the Presbyterian Church of Ghana prayed earnestly for her healing. Yet, when she died, almost every pastor who spoke to us repeated that phrase. It is God who gives and God who takes. Far from bringing comfort, those words made the grief heavier. I couldn't understand how God would take Cecilia at such a young age. God knew the role Cecilia played in her mother's life. Her mother had already lost her husband and faced many life struggles. Cecilia was her only support system. My concern was, why then would God take the life of Cecilia and in such a painful way? This raises an important question. What does this scripture actually mean? And how accurate is it when used in pastoral care, especially in the context of grief and theodicy? And what does it reveal about the nature of God? This is Faith and Furious. Let me begin by stating this. The book of Job is theologically complex. But for today, I want to look at Job 1:21 from a pastoral care perspective and ask, how can we be better equipped to provide spiritual support, counseling, and guidance to grieving families? For many people, the phrase God gives and God takes is automatically assumed to be biblical truth, so it must apply in every situation. But here is the thing. Just because something is in the Bible doesn't mean it should be applied universally without context. When I read the Bible, I try to hear at least three voices. The voice of the narrator, that is the one telling the story. The character's voice, I'm looking at those inside the story processing the experiences. And the voice of God, what God reveals about God's self in the text. All these three matter and each plays a role in scriptural interpretation. So let's take a close look at Job 1:21. In Job chapter 1, Job loses nearly everything. Hasatan in Hebrew, that is the Satan, appears before God and receives permission to test Job's faith. He argues that Job only serves God because of his wealth and blessings and the goodies he's receiving from God. So one by one, Job loses his children, his possessions, and even his health. He was covered in boils and sores. Job sits in deep pains. In verse 21, Job speaks these famous words. Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I shall return. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Here, Job was processing his suffering and grief, and he makes a bold confession that is rooted in his understanding of his own experience. His statement was not a divine command or a theological formula. It was his own heartfelt confession in that moment. The phrase, naked I came, naked I shall return, uses life's beginning and end to underline human dependency and teach that material possession is temporary. Job acknowledged that life begins and ends with nothing. We are dependent on God. He recognizes God's sovereignty and sees both blessings and loss being under God's authority. But notice that the narrative complicates this. It was actually the Satan who inflicted the losses, not God directly. Job's theology reflects his attempt to make sense of the tragedy he was experiencing, not a timeless doctrine that we must apply in every situation for people going through similar or some kind of same situation that Job went through. So quoting "the Lord gives, the Lord takes away" when one grieves can be more harmful than comforting. It risks making God look like the direct cause of someone's death, as if he personally killed the person. This can leave many Christians, many grieving families confused, angry, or even resentful towards God. What comforted Job in the end was God's presence in the whirlwind and the freedom to express his grief honestly. So Job 121 can inspire us. It can remind us that life is a gift, but it must be held together with lament. That is, the boldness to name the pain honestly, with hope pointing to the resurrection of Christ and God's comfort, and with solidarity, that is standing with mourners and weeping with those who weep. The book of Job itself warns us, attributing every tragedy directly to God misrepresents God's character. Job's friend did the same thing many pastors do, insisting that his suffering must be God's punishment. In the end, God rebuked them because scripture portrays God as compassionate, as just and abundant in steadfast love. If we use Job 121 without context, we risk portraying God as cruel and indifferent. Now, I'm not here to defend God. That is not the purpose of this conversation. But when we use Job 121 carelessly, we rob people of their own right to grieve and to ask hard questions. We make them feel as if their pains shows a lack of faith. But true pastoral care acknowledges that grief looks different for everyone, and not every verse is appropriate in every situation. Take my friend Cecilia, for example. She did not die because God took her away. She died because of irresponsibility and a broken health system. It took more than 5 days before she could even get a bed at the hospital. Basic tests could not be done in Ghana and had to be sent all the way to South Africa. By the time the result returned, Cecilia had already died. That was not God's doing, it was human failure. Recently, 16 children lost their life in a gory accident in Ghana. They did not die because God called them home. These children died because our roads are unsafe and leaders have failed to take responsibility. These were preventable deaths. So saying the Lord gives and the Lord takes in such situation can distract us from the rare issue: poor healthcare system, negligence, lack of accountability, and unsafe infrastructure. Yes, all life belongs to God, but many tragedies happen because of human failure, not because God delights in taking away or God delights in watching people die and watching people grieve for it. So, Job's words in this context were his personal way of processing his grief. It wasn't a universal rule for how we must explain our tragedy. It wasn't directly from God. These were not the words of God in order to say that is what God wills for us. As pastoral caregivers, Christians, our role is not to silence grief with theology, but to walk with people in their pain, pointing them towards God's presence, hope, and love, while also naming human responsibilities where it exists. I hope this helps. Let me know your thoughts and comments in the comment section. And always remember that theology is fine.